Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Change Board webinar, Leading Through Change, How to Develop Your Agility. My name's Mary Appleton, and I'm Change Board's editor. We're delighted to be joined here today by Adam Kingl, Executive Director of Thought Leadership at London Business School. He's going to be talking about the ever-complex business climate, how you can navigate a world faced with unremitting change, and how you can drive innovation in your business. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few guidelines. Throughout the webinar, if you'd like to pose a question or a comment to Adam, please do enter this in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen and click send. We'll be taking some questions after the presentation, but please do feel free to pose the question at any time, and we'll try to get through as many as we can later on. We'll also be running a few polls through the presentation, which will flash up on your screen. So just follow the on-screen instructions to vote, and we'll allow about 30 seconds per poll. We'll also be running a live Twitter feed throughout the webinar, so please do credit your tweets with @ChangeBoard, @LBS, and @Adam__Kingl. We'll also be recording the webinar, so we'll send you a link to the full recording in the next few days. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Adam. Adam sits on London Business School's Executive Education Board and is responsible for curating and representing the school's research and transforming it into many formats for a practitioner audience. So, over to you, Adam.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm going to be really exciting about the day and not just the weather we're having, of course, but I think this is a great day because it's one of those rare moments when we get a decent amount of time to talk about what I think are some of the most profound and pressing issues in business today. I actually believe that we are at a point in business history where we have to change not only our practices, but we have to change the fundamental principles upon which we base our leadership, our organizations, and so on. So as Kurt Lewin, the founder of social psychology, once said, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And believe me, none of what I'm going to talk about to you today is just theory. The ideas I'm going to share are things that London Business School Executive Education and the Management Lab, a research institute that started here, we're working on in some of the most complex and in some of the biggest organizations in the world. So I'm really going to be sharing and integrating those thoughts of two of our professors in particular, Gary Hamel in our strategy department and Dan Cable in our organizational behavior department. So if you will, I'm sharing a macro and a micro perspective, strategic and psychological perspectives that I think shift the advocacy for what to do regarding change and what to do regarding building the core competence of agility. Basically, the structure of the webinar will be really simple. I'm going to talk about the challenges or problems, if you like, that I think pretty much lie outside the performance envelope of business as usual. These are not challenges that our current organizations are equipped to tackle. So make or break challenges that will inform who wins, who loses over the next decade and beyond. What are those? What are the new demands those challenges are putting on our organizations? Then more importantly, perhaps we're going to dig into some of those very deep why questions, starting to get at the very root causes that are embedded in our organizational architecture and ideology, two characteristics of our organization that we almost never talk about. Then we'll explore what's at stake and, of course, the cost of our failure to adapt. So that's basically the setup. What are we up against to be truly fit for the future? Then we're really going to talk about what do we do about that. So we'll start with some thoughts around where the solution space may be, and for sure where we're going to end is with some suggestions for action, and particularly what you can do independent of where you sit in your organization. So I'm assuming most of you are senior leaders. That doesn't mean, as you well know, that your influence is unlimited. All kinds of constraints on what you can do, how many levers you pull in your organization, your ability simply to exercise your authority as you like. So given those practical constraints, what are you going to do? How do you make a bigger impact that you might have expected? So that's broadly where we're going today. And we're going to start with the macro view. And let me share some thoughts that really originated with our Professor Gary Hamel. Well, look, there's all manner of advice about how to deal with change, be it personally, professionally, organizationally. We've been urged to yell alarm, my iceberg is melting, which of course creates fear and anxiety. And that was all fine over the last 10 years or so. I'm not sure if the contemporary research bears that out as an effective tactic. And we're going to return to this. But here's really some questions I'd like you to start with in diagnosing how well you are genuinely leading change. Are you just treating the symptoms, or are you enabling your company to be fit for the future? In other words, are you capable of changing as fast as the world around you? Are we as adaptable and creative and inspirational as the human beings that compose our organization? Is there a more fundamental level in which we can operate in order to make agility an autonomic response in the organization? Let me just explain what I mean by autonomic response. You know, when you look at someone that you're attracted to and your pupils automatically dilate, you don't fret about it. You don't have to consciously make an effort. You don't have to send a 12-point change plan to your eyeballs. It just happens. So we're going to look at how do we make change in our organization feel like that, an autonomic response. Well, in order to look at what might be holding us back from being truly agile at a genomic level, we probably first have to explore, well, what is our common organizational DNA today? So here's what I would say. I would bet your organization is a mashup of two core ideas. One, military command structures, which start as far back in human history as you can go. Even Julius Caesar, the gent on the left, was a master of it, but he wasn't the originator. So a mashup of military command structures and the disciplines of scientific engineering. So this gent on the right is Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management. That's continuous improvement. That evolved into Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma, Revenge of the Bride of Lean Six Sigma, whatever the hell. But these are the foundations. And basically, these things come together in the late 19th century to form, and we have a word for this, called bureaucracy. So here's Max Weber, famous German sociologist, writing in about 1910. He says, bureaucracy is superior to any other form in precision, in stability, in the stringency of its discipline, and its reliability. So if you have a car in your garage, if every person in your family has a mobile device, if you are not spending most of your time growing your own food, you've got to thank the people that invented bureaucracy. A lot of wealth was able to be created thanks to that Industrial Revolution era invention. But I'd like to ask you fundamentally, what was the problem that bureaucracy was invented to solve? So what problem do you think that big management innovation called bureaucracy has been trying to solve for the last 150 years of management? Now, you heard that we're going to be doing these polls. So here's your first one, just to keep you on your toes. You're going to have 30 seconds to answer. Please choose whichever of these 5 choices you would prefer. I have a bit of music here to keep us occupied during these 30 seconds. And I have it on good authority. It's exactly 30 seconds long, and you'll see why. So please answer the poll now. Okay, obviously you've got to love countdown, right? The beauty of it is exactly 30 seconds. So we're gonna be collating your responses, and I'll see your answers momentarily. So A, build cradle to grave support for workers was 9%, 13% of you said enhance strategic thinking. None of you said improve employee incentives. Quite right, too. Master complexity at scale, 58%, and 20% said serve shareholders. Well, you know, I would agree with the majority, the 58%, who said it is about mastering complexity at scale. You'd like to think it's about enhancing strategic thinking. I think that might be It might assist, but really, bureaucracy has been an enabler, and it's to do really kind of one thing: excise irregularity. It's efficiency. It's about reliability. Basically, that complexity at scale. So, what that means is basically you drive irregularity out and conformity in. This is the whole purpose of bureaucracy. I need conformity to job requirements, to customer requirements, to client schedules, to quality standards, to budgets. And so we're trying to get these obstreperous human beings to behave like machines. That was the Industrial Revolution goal: turn human beings into semi-programmable robots. Part of the issue with that is that much of that industrial activity is now performed by real robots. But we haven't really changed how we manage the human beings who remain. So bureaucracy, I would say, most likely is your organization's standard operating system. It is in your organization's DNA, even if you aren't aware of it at a conscious level. And I think we are held hostage now by bureaucracy's legacy. It is a system that had its day in the sun, no doubt, but is no longer fit for purpose. As a result, we are less adaptive and innovative than we could be by a long margin. Bureaucracy is, I believe, a tax on human effort and a drag on productivity. So we are dragging ourselves down, while at the same time, the pace of change today is exponential rather than linear. You all have heard, VUCA. I just think the world is actually a whole lot VUCA than it used to be even 5 years ago. We wake up in a world today where I'm seeing it's irregular people with the irregular ideas doing irregular things who are creating the irregular wealth. But we have organizations that were never built to do that. You can just watch this happen as your organizations grow. Just look at this list: more rules, more people who can say no to any request, more silos, more lawyers, more SAP, and you just watch the cement slowly set. So we said that bureaucracy was brought in to improve efficiency. Well, then we must be asking ourselves, when did bureaucracy start to create the opposite of efficiency? Well, I'd say now, right now in our age. For sure, bureaucracy is becoming an extraordinary economic drag on most societies. And you can kind of think of this as managerial diseconomies of scale. Bureaucratic organizations are inertial. They are incremental. They are disempowering. Leaders are becoming more insulated from market realities and spending ever more time battling internal complexity. At the same time, employees become ever more entangled in red tape and prevented from exercising their own judgment and initiative, and so they become passive rule followers, helpless and frustrated. And the thing that's a little frustrating for me personally is we really haven't made any serious attempt to change this yet. Mostly as managers, you know this, right? If we're honest with ourselves, we fiddle at the margins. So, we talk about flattening the hierarchy, we take out maybe one level or something, but we haven't eliminated it, or we celebrate empowerment, but we don't give up our own prerogatives, right? We're not very willing to give up our power. We encourage employees to speak up, but we don't let them choose their leaders. That would be very dangerous. But I've never met a single leader who says they are a fan of bureaucracy, but I have met very few leaders who've done anything serious to tackle it. And that is why we're confronting this topic today. There are leading organizations that I would call in the management vanguard. They are in all different industries, in different countries, managing an extraordinary amount of complexity and size with almost no bureaucracy at all. So it can be done. We'll go into it a little, so if you just give me a little time, we'll come back. But now, I hope you would agree by now that even if we couldn't find those on the vanguard, bureaucracy would be worth killing, right? And let's look at this in a little more detail and maybe the issues through two of bureaucracy's standard characteristics: its architecture and its ideology. Let's start with architecture. So just pick a person anywhere in the world. Let's just pretend you could talk to anyone in the world, and you ask that individual to draw a picture of their organization's architecture, their organizational structure. What's your org chart? What sort of picture do you think they're going to draw? Almost anyone in the world. Is that chart going to look like a circle? Is the shape of the org chart going to be a square? Is it going to be a hexagon? Is it going to be an octagon? Is it going to be a right triangle? Well, it's probably going to be this, right? A classic pyramidal triangle. Typical organizational chart, right? It is one of humanity's most durable social structures. This was how pharaohs structured the construction of the pyramids. This is how Ford constructed his empire. You put an emperor in there or you put in a CEO, the architecture is the same. But it's not a network. It's not an ecosystem. It's not a community. This is the exoskeleton of bureaucracy, and it structurally and preemptively empowers the few, disempowers pretty much everybody else, and it's completely incompatible with adaptability and innovation. Let me show you why. Here's an example. I pulled this out of a PDF document. This was a chart that was part of a change program that went to 70,000 people in a company all of you would know, but I will not embarrass them. So here you can see how in their thinking, in architecting a change program, ironically, assumes the traditional hierarchy. See, executives, managers, employees, right? Thinkers, coordinators, doers. So now they're listing all the behaviors that they want these different levels to have. So let's just look at one behavior, thinking strategically. What have they just told 95% of the organization? Don't think, don't think. As if the future gets created by a handful of 60-year-olds sitting in corporate towers. Not so much anymore. So this is organizational apartheid, right? It creates a caste system. You're assuming that all the brains are found only at the executive level. And so you're saying, don't worry about all those disruptive technologies you're seeing. Don't worry about those new customers you're talking to. Don't worry about what you see changing in the world. We'll worry about strategy at the top. It is a dangerous conceit. And this is not an isolated thing, but that's the view. Strategy only gets set at the top. I think that's rubbish. So architecturally, our organizations are not built to change. Ideology, we also have to change that, because if we don't change these things, I can tell you, nothing else fundamentally changes. No other change initiative is probably going to be successful. Again, we don't really talk about ideology in business. I would assume most of you listening now, you probably think of yourself as a pragmatist in relation to business. We're in the middle of a general election now, so you may have a political ideology. You perhaps have a religious ideology, but at work, you're pragmatic, right? Deliver results, get this stuff done, and so on. But underlying management, there's a very, very powerful ideology, and I'm going to try to reveal it in this way. Go to a thesaurus in whatever language, Portuguese, French, German, doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Look for the synonym of the word manage when we use it as a verb, to manage. So if you go to any thesaurus or dictionary, you look at that word manage, what do you think is the most common synonym that you would see? What is the ideology that underlies management thinking? So we're going to do a poll. I'd like you to complete this sentence, which is also going to be revelatory for how you think about your organization. Yeah, to manage is to what? So here are your choices: A, B, C, D, E. Let's see if we can get our music cue up here, and please vote now. Thank you, Carol Vorderman and company. So generally when I ask this question in a room, it's a pretty common response. So let's see, 2% of you said budget, 45% said control, 36% said coordinate, no one said incentivize, quite right too, it probably has nothing to do with it, and 16% said inspire. Those are the optimists in the room, so thank you for that. Certainly I think coordination is a big part of management, but the most common response that you're going to see in any language, and again the majority of you I think were spot on here, and I think this is how management feels in too many of our organizations, that to manage equals to control. So on the front lines, be it whether it's manufacturing, services, products, managers manufacture control. They are the enforcers. They are the ideology of management manifested as to control. So let me go back to Max Weber. He sort of praised bureaucracy, but at the same time, he knew what it was intended to do. He even had forecast some of its dangers. He said bureaucracy is the most rational known means of carrying out imperative control over human beings. That was what bureaucracy was invented to do. And we have all kinds of ways of talking about it, but in the end, it's all about getting that control. We can't run anything of any complexity and magnitude without control, don't get me wrong. The problem is, over time, controlism as an ideology metastasizes in a way that it drives autonomy and freedom and responsibility out. So you'd hope that perhaps originally it was about coordination, but this has metastasized into, if you will, an organizational tumor. And there is a cost to that tumor. So let's talk about this point. Bureaucracy is not only disabling, it's also getting very, very expensive. And so I'm just going to share a little hard data with you from Gary Hamel and the Management Lab. I promise I'll be swift, but it's useful. So let's start here. We all know that productivity growth is the engine of economic prosperity. So here's average growth in output per hour. You can see 80 years there, 1891 to 1972, growth in output per hour, 2.36%. And since then, over the last 45 years, almost halved. This is US data, but it's not very different across the OECD, not very different at all. And you might think, well, what about the gig economy, the sharing economy? But look at this, the percentage of self-employed workers is at an all-time low. It has halved since 1948. Bureaucracy is eating the economy. It's eating the British economy, the German economy, different countries. I'm not going to go through all of those now, but here's also what's quite scary. Look at this data. These are the number of people tied up in corporate bureaucracies having mushroomed. So look at this figure. At 1983 is indexed as 100. So the green line is the number of managers, supervisors, compliance officers, and support staff. That's the green line, the bureaucratic class. And you can see that over the last 30 years, it's doubled, almost doubled. Meanwhile, employment in all other occupations, the blue line, the value creating roles, has risen by no more than 40%. Conclusion, bureaucratic roles have grown twice as much as all other roles over the past 30 plus years. I'd like to know what it is in your organization. Now remember, this is anonymous, so let's be honest with one another. What percent of your employees are dedicated to bureaucracy? Now, the answer that would most closely resemble your estimate may not be one of these 5 answers. Just choose the closest number to your estimate. So I want to know, what would you estimate are the percent of your employees who are managers, administrators, support staff, and internal compliance officers? Okay, so what percent of your organization supports the bureaucratic machine? Vote now. Okay, thank you very much for voting. I think that was the last poll, but thank you for that. So let's see what you said. So we have, let's see, I think 4%, 31% of you said it's 45%. So I'm dealing with 2% here. But so far the biggest number is 45%. 27% of you said 60%. So actually there's quite a huge chunk here. If I'm not mistaken, let me do my math really quickly. Yeah, 30, 40, 55, 65, almost 75% of you chose C, D, or E. So 3/4 of you said the percent of your organization dedicated to bureaucracy is almost or well over half of your employees. Okay. That's kind of scary. Yeah, I was thinking maybe most of the answers would be in the B, C, D range, and on the other hand, maybe I'm not terribly surprised. So let's see if let me just show you now what the direct cost of this is. And now I'm showing you US data, but again, this is not different across the OECD. So the data I'm showing you here was based on some work done by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. So and you'll see that the US is actually on average better off than some of the percents that you just shared with me. Basically, the US workforce is about 135 million people in work. Of that 135, 18.5 million are managers or supervisors. 5.3 million are administrative support, be they in HR or finance or planning. And then you have another 18 million people who are spending all day, every day, complying with bureaucratic requests. They took external compliance out. This is only internal compliance. So this is not government regulation. This is internal to the organization. And by the way, it's similar in Australia. There's a 2014 Deloitte study estimated that internal compliance swallowed up 16% of employees' time. And about 18% of those rules that they were enforcing were unnecessary or low value add. So when you add all these things together, you have 41.8 million people. That is almost a third of the entire workforce who are basically serving the bureaucratic machine, creating little or no economic value. The management lab at LBS has estimated that if we redeployed half of the bureaucrats in the economy into work that actually creates wealth, then for the OECD alone, that's $9 trillion of additional output, 3 trillion of that in the US alone. So if that were realized over the next 10 years, it doubles productivity growth in the OECD, bringing us back to productivity levels unseen since the apex of the Industrial Revolution. There is no other plan or investment incentive or education or infrastructure or policy proposal that comes anywhere near matching this productivity impact. If you took all that bureaucratic overhead and culled it, and I'm not suggesting removing it entirely, right? I'm just saying have it. And that's a group which is demonstrably not creating value, because I know I can run equally complex, more productive organizations with a fraction of the bureaucratic load. Then we are removing a net drag on the economy. There is literally a bureaucratic tax on human activity. And so scholars will give you no argument that bureaucracy is disabling in terms of innovation and adaptability. I'm adding it's also very expensive, and I think it's a tax we can no longer bear. What you'd like to believe that competitive pressures will force companies to solve this problem. At some point, you think they'll recognize this is the last real fat that exists in the organization, so they have to go after this. You know, I don't know. I'm a little dubious about that, because they've been reluctant, really, to cut it historically. Companies have been under a lot of pressure for a long time now. The recession, globalization, now you have the whole digital thing. If it hasn't happened yet, I wonder if they really would suddenly begin to take this seriously. They might. Some CEOs do. Some do. Jeff Immelt, the chairman and CEO of GE, in his last chairman's letter in his annual report, he said, I'm going to war with bureaucracy. Now, I don't know how effective he's going to be. I think he will be effective, because GE is a very, very smart company. But he's saying this is now the next big thing for us. We are going to kill this thing. So I promise you, we're not just in the realm of theory here. But look, I also think as a society, we have an interest not only in furthering entrepreneurship, for sure we do, but we have an interest in helping large institutions to become as adaptable as they can. Because if they are not, they're going to be misusing society's resources. Okay, I thank you for your patience. We went deep into some numbers there and pointing out some political realities. It's tough stuff, I admit. So now we're going to ask, is there really an alternative? And maybe what are some of the pitfalls? So where's the solution space? Bureaucracy is well defended, right? Its leaders have learned how to succeed within their organizations, and they are not eager now to change the rules of the game. Given this, what will it take to reduce bureaucracy's hold on our organizations? First, a healthy dose of outrage. This is where I think you have to start, yeah? Because, you know, we've all been too nice about this. Maybe it's because we're not sure about how this might turn out for us, so we're not willing to start. But I think you actually have to be fairly angry at the fact that we have millions of employees showing up every day, and they're working physically, but they're leaving most of that imagination, creativity, passion at home. You have to have a lot less resignation and a lot more indignation. I'll tell you why I believe that, but it's not because I'm some angry old guy who's pissed at the world, I think about this. Maybe this is a stretch, but I don't think so. Think about bureaucracy. It is deeply entrenched, rather disempowering, but effective social institution historically. So bureaucracy is familiar and deeply embedded. It can reward excellence and competence, but also gamesmanship, politicking, hoarding information, negotiating targets, building fiefdoms. So we must ask ourselves, is there any reason to believe in change? Because some of you might be rightly skeptical. Maybe this is impossible. Well, if you go back look at almost all of human history, slavery was regarded as almost inevitable. You know, Rome gets some credit for pioneering some of the ideas of democracy, but 70% of all individuals in Rome were slaves. And yet nobody really thinks anymore of slavery as some kind of inevitable part of the human condition. Even 100 years ago and further back, we just assumed that patriarchy would always be with us, that women would always be disadvantaged in every society, would be treated as second-class citizens, not have the same educational, social opportunities. Well, gladly, a smaller and smaller number of people around the world every year believe that to be true. So when we start to think, how do things change that are deeply entrenched and been there for years? Well, how did slavery change? How does patriarchy change? And sometimes there's a revolution, but not always, right? But it always starts with moral courage. Not just getting angry, but really being able to look at something and recognizing and saying this is wrong. Having the courage to stand up and say no more. Because the things you have to change are the things that you find intolerable. So look at slavery, patriarchy. The most powerful argument for change has always been that human beings have a right fully to develop and exercise their gifts, and that barriers, impediments to doing that are iniquitous. That the goal is to give every human being the maximum opportunity possible to develop and use their gifts. And that's the argument that ultimately eradicates slavery. It's the argument that is slowly undermining patriarchy. We have to get angry that our organizations seem to have so little tolerance for curiosity, for playfulness, the intuition, the hope, the things that actually make us human beings. Because human beings are human beings, right? Not human capital. I would say really that's the starting point. Otherwise, the disengagement of our people is wholly preempting any successful change or transformation into an agile organization. And make no mistake, most of our people are not fully engaged. I'm sure you all are familiar with some of this data. This was a sample of more than 100,000 employees by Gallup. I think they do this about every other year. Many different countries and industries. This one was from about 2 years ago. You can see, how engaged are you, Mr. and Mrs. Employee? Well, only 13% reported they're highly engaged in their work. There's another bigger group, 24%, who are actively disengaged. This effectively means they will sabotage given half a chance. And then you see 63% who really don't care. You know, they show up for work. What's kind of amazing is that when I show this to groups of very senior executives, and you might be doing this yourself now, I hope not, they just kind of shrug, nod resignedly, yeah, doesn't surprise me. Well, we've got to change our attitude about this. Imagine if you were all a group of physicians at a medical conference, and I was getting up and I was saying, we surveyed all of you in this room, all of you GPs, and out of 100 people that you typically see during the course of a week as a general practitioner, our survey showed you killed a quarter of your patients. I don't know how, but somehow they just died. 13% got better. The rest didn't really have to come into your office at all because you made no difference. For most physicians, that would be an unacceptable outcome. They would be outraged. They would be saying, we have to change some fundamental things right now. Or let's say we were teachers. I'm at a teachers conference. You're all teachers. I'm saying, we surveyed your students at the end of the year. We did an assessment and we learned 24% of the kids got stupider. We don't know how that happened, but they literally went backwards. 13% learned something. 63% made no difference whatsoever. They could have come into school. They didn't have to come into school. Really didn't matter. Teachers will be rightfully outraged. Managers shrug resignedly, typically. So, and as a result of that, we have for too long wasted more human capacity than we use. This is an artifact of bureaucracy. This waste of human potential is unconscionable. Now, the good news, there is good news. Some leaders are starting to look at fundamental change and thinking about engagement, empowerment, versus that ideology of control. For example, any Ritz-Carlton employee can spend $2,000 a day on any customer problem without seeking anyone else's permission. Their leadership says, as leaders, we create the sandbox and general rules of how our people are expected to play in it. But for them to really generate the unique and memorable, we have to empower them. You just can't micromanage unique and memorable outcomes. Well, you might say somebody has to control. Well, I would respond, yeah, there needs to be control. Control has to happen. But one of the places we're heading with this is there are trade-offs here, right? There's an apparent trade-off. What we sometimes say after we celebrate autonomy is we go, well, somebody has to have control. So the mental model there, which is fair enough, I understand, but the model is saying freedom and control may have trade-offs. And so how do we manage that? Partly what I think we should consider is how do you shift that trade-off out rather than think of it as a zero-sum game, because that's too easy. So you have to rethink the variables and the whole equation. So maybe there's this impending revolution in expectations around control. The second prerequisite is data. Enumerate the costs of your bureaucracy, because bureaucrats pay attention to things that can be measured. That's why every organization needs to start to measure its bureaucratic disability. I assume you've all heard of BMI, right? Body Mass Index. Well, Gary Hamel has created the Bureaucratic Mass Index. You can take this for free. There's a website. It's important to surface the costs of bureaucracy. You do that, and then you'll see what all the people who've taken this survey have said. And this is really important, starting to surface this, not just as a theory, but sharing some data. Third, I think the alternative to bureaucracy has to emerge. It can't be imposed top-down. That's a paradox, right? So it's not like a 6-month project where we say, let's get rid of that, do it like that, problem solved. I think those things haven't worked because the old model has emerged over many, many decades with a lot of trial and error, figuring out what's worked, what hasn't. The idea we're going to replace that with this highly engineered thing that we're just going to dump on you, it's not going to happen. So I don't think it's going to take decades, but I don't think it can be done in 12 months. So Gary Hamel has a great phrase that I'd just like to use here. Revolutionary goals, evolutionary steps. Have revolutionary goals, take evolutionary steps. So we have to change the way we change. We have to look at the DNA. What we need instead in how we do change is not some top-down initiative, perhaps something more like a hackathon, an open, company-wide effort to collectively reinvent the management model around post-bureaucratic principles, such as, for example, meritocracy, experimentation, disaggregation. Fourth, traditional organization hopes they will find issues and manage risk around change by relying on structures. I don't think that's the solution, because that abrogates responsibility for risk for anyone not in the formal structure that's accountable to risk by title or department or both. So, for example, if you have a chief risk officer, you're kind of telling the rest of the organization they don't have to be alert to risks. Here's an example. So W.L. Gore, I'm sure many of you have heard of them, Vanguard company. They're billion-dollar products, materials, medical devices business. They completely confuse the regulators because they're used to getting compliance, the regulators, through all the traditional top-down stuff. The way risk management works as Gore is you get hired in the company, you have a mentor for starters. You don't have a boss. You have someone who helps give you advice about your career, and the mentor spends a lot of time on values, and you don't have a title. Everyone in the company is an associate. One of the first lessons you learn is about waterline issues, waterline risks, things that, like a torpedo, are risks that would hold the company under the waterline. So what you're taught is that every associate is the company's chief risk officer. Everybody. There's no such job title there. It's everybody. So what does that mean in practice? Well, it means if you're sitting in a meeting anywhere where you think there's a potential for a waterline issue, be it regulatory noncompliance or we're at risk of letting down a customer, or this is damaging to our brand, or it's a financial risk, you are required to speak up. And you'd know about what those issues are because these teams spend a lot of time together debating, talking about risk issues, right? Information is widely shared. How do they find issues in a traditional organization? How do they mitigate risk, particularly through change in traditional organizations? Well, the difference is the traditional organization relies on structures. Look at what happened in the financial crisis. There were a lot of people in those organizations who knew the risks that they were creating, both for themselves and for their customers, but the powerful functions, be it marketing or product development or sales, they could not be challenged. It was political suicide at Lehman and wherever else to stand up and say, these products are going to explode. They're toxic. You just couldn't say that because all these people's compensation depended on them. So if you create a culture where people are afraid to challenge others, where you can't talk about those risks, you really aren't managing them well. If you sit in on a meeting at Gore for 2 hours, at some point someone will invariably say, is there a waterline issue we're not thinking about here? And everyone steps back and goes, okay, let's think about that. But in too many companies, that role rests with a fairly small number of people who, and this is terrible, have an adversarial role with the rest of the company. Basically, everyone's just trying to get around the risk officers, get through those people. And I don't want you to think either, that, for example, the vanguard have to be tech companies. It can be, standard industries. This is Morningstar. They're the world's largest tomato producer based in Central California. They have no quality assurance people at all. Nobody has quality assurance in their title. Yet they're sending out 1,000-kilo packs of tomato stuff that's going to end up in the food supply. But what happens, you have a bunch of people who most of them are not even university educated, but they have read and learned everything they can about microbiology, about food safety. They don't have food safety in their titles, but they say our whole company depends on never making anybody ill from our products. So why wouldn't we do these things? So they're trying to syndicate the responsibility for managing risk. And to a lot of people, I would say that means, well, no one's responsible. Well, no, that means everyone's responsible. It's like if your parents, right, your two parents walking with your kid down the street, there's not one parent who's responsible for, keeping the kid from running out into the road, but the other parent is solely responsible from keeping the kid from tripping over. The parents are responsible jointly and completely. So I would argue that these types of companies, the Gores and the Morningstars of the world, end up with far fewer lawsuits, far fewer big financial risks, because there's a sense of shared destiny, shared accountability. And people feel there's a safe environment to speak up. So there's less risk inherent in any activity, including internal change initiatives. Okay, so you remember I showed you this, right? This list from earlier. This is a dynamic in too many of our organizations. And when we say management, too many people think of this list. Well, let's not resign ourselves to management 1.0. Instead, let's consider how do we hack management. And it might start with some of the points on this list. Let's start with the foundation of moral courage and say we have to change. That's number one. We've said you have to challenge some assumptions about bureaucracy, its architecture and ideology. Is there another way? And then we should start to consider what might be the typical characteristics in management 2.0. We touched on many of these already. Number 10 is quite interesting. At Morningstar, their founder and owner is a guy named Chris Rufer. He built an entire organization with no managers at all. So when Gary Hamel wrote an article about Morningstar in Harvard Business Review, HBR called the article, "First Kill All the Managers," which is from Shakespeare, right? First kill all the lawyers. That's an interesting idea. But this is not about killing the managers. In fact, Chris Rufer says, I have a company where everybody's a manager. So he's taken the work that historically was done by this elevated class of individuals called managers and distributed them out through the organization. So the other thing that strikes me about these kinds of vanguard companies is, so the goal of management 1.0 was efficiency at scale, right? We still need that. But more and more, I think this challenge in management 2.0 in the post-industrial age is entrepreneurship at scale. Because when you think about passion, imagination, innovation, adaptability, you're describing entrepreneurs. They're typically young, they're filled with passion, they're innovative, they're changing the rules, but we also have to be able to scale that. So when you look at W.L. Gore, look at Morningstar, they're learning how to do that. So we've just explored how to rethink our approach to management and to risk in the midst of change, not to rely on structures. Consistent with that macro view is the micro view from neuroscience and psychology that says that agile thinking requires an army of volunteers, not conscripts, okay? That the team should be encouraged to pursue themes, issues, and challenges around change according to their strengths, passions, and gifts. Build excitement, curiosity versus anxiety and fear. So here's where I'm sharing some research from Professor Dan Cable, who argues that the behaviors triggered by positive emotions and negative emotions are zero-sum. In other words, if one increases, the other decreases. So playfulness, for example, is inhibited by negative emotions, such as fear, in all species, be they rats or humans. Science has demonstrated this over the last 5-10 years. What's more, the fear switch is much harder to turn off than it is to turn on. So therefore, I propose we put to bed the John Cotter conceit of, help, our iceberg is melting, igniting change by creating terror around a burning platform. Maybe something more like this. Wouldn't it be exciting if we redecorated our iceberg? And other studies, there's a study by Anna Steinhage, who's a PhD candidate here at LBS, which shows that when managers feel anxiety about policies and change, they are more likely to undermine their colleagues, such as by deliberately belittling their opinions. Conversely, when they feel excitement, they are more likely to be creative and collaborative. So this is all from the field of positive psychology. So similar behaviors are shown if competition, change is framed as a win or a gain. That sparks positive creative behaviors. You frame change as a loss or fear, you get negative undermining behaviors. So remember just this, fear is kryptonite to positivity. When people's or the organization's limitations are the focus, the ability to play to our strengths is sapped. A more promising route for organizations who want to inspire creative solutions, creative change, is dial down the fear and anxiety and ramp up the excitement when leaders stimulate positive emotions. The good news that excitement is kryptonite to fear. Okay, I'm just going to end with this thought. Remember those appalling Gallup poll results? 87% of employees are not engaged. I think we just have to visualize how horrendous that is. So here's exactly 100 bodies. Let's say we exactly had 100 people in our company. And I said, how many of you are engaged? And that's the answer that I got. Disgusting. So this is a symptom of what we have to work on first before we have any hope of leading change successfully, for whatever those reasons are. The engagement, our language of excitement has to change. We have to address the lack of humanity in our organizations, or we will never be able to successfully address agility and innovation. The reality is most of our organizations waste more employability than they use. Millions of employees are showing up to work every day, leaving their humanity and their best ideas at home. So, leaving you with this thought, isn't it time to make sure our organizations are at least as human as the individuals in them? Okay, I've covered a lot of territory. I know you have a lot of questions. So here are just a couple of extra places you can go for more information. So more on the macro strategic view of management innovation. Here are two websites from Gary Hamel. All of that's free. So there are papers, case studies, videos, discussions. And then Dan Cable, the micro psychological view, a neuroscience view, you could read more about that from the vanguard of this thinking on the back of his topic on leading change in our executive education pages. And I think this is really incredible stuff that together is creating a consistent picture of how we really have to tackle change now in the 21st century. Just to leave you with top 5 takeaways for the day. There they are. I'm not going to read them. Bureaucracy is the biggest risk to prosperity today. It undermines initiative, it stifles creativity, but we are not hostages to precedent. We can beat bureaucracy. We can have a humanistic approach. We can use a positive approach to our emotions we take to work. But that approach has to be bold and iterative and collaborative and emergent. Thank you. Really thank you for your time. Fantastic to spend this rare hour together. And I'm happy to take your questions now, so I'll pass the proceedings over to Mary. Thank you all so much.
Hi, Adam. Thank you very much indeed for a really insightful presentation today. I was really surprised when you showed the slides around the insights about the cost of bureaucracy. That was pretty shocking, actually.
Yes, it is, isn't it? But that's the problem. When we often talk about so-called human issues and capabilities, we leave it at a qualitative level. And as we know, there's an old cliche: if you want to change something in the organization, show numbers. So I thought that was perhaps a different approach to take today.
Yeah, no, that's really good. So just a reminder, everyone, we've got about kind of 10 minutes for questions. You can pose these at the right-hand side of your screen using the chat facility, and we'll try and get through as many as we can this afternoon. So we've had a few come in, so I'll try and get through as many as I can. So Adam, John asks, you mentioned we have to change the way we think about change, but how do you encourage this kind of spirit of entrepreneurship at scale in businesses that have not historically operated in this way?
Sure. So I would use the management principle of experimentation. And this is actually something we even do at London Business School internally. So you can't ask people to start doing things differently through this whole top-down, huge 14-step approach where you are prescribing all the behaviors. You have to give people a lot of freedom. And some people aren't going to be used to that. I think that assumption is implicit in your question. But try to get people organized into small communities where they can start to encourage one another on a micro view. Get them to start to test some hypotheses. Okay, if we did this differently, it might achieve that result, and then share those results with the organization. The other important thing to note in where we have to stray from the traditional organizational philosophy is if an experiment fails, if a hypothesis is disproven, you have to reward the learning thereof, right? You don't say your experiment failed, so you're a failure, go sit back in your go get back in your box, right? You've got to say every experiment is useful because it tells us what we might be able to do differently and maybe what we shouldn't be doing differently. And you need to get that happening throughout the organization at micro levels, rather than giving everyone this huge plan to say, here is the future, and this time next year it'll all be done.
Okay. And from an individual perspective, Adam, what kind of leadership skills do you think you need to really get people to buy into all of this? And how can you develop these as a leader yourself?
Sure, that's a great question, right? So what does it mean for me individually? Well, first, there's a really just tactical thing that I talked about at the end there, and that is think about what emotions you're using. It is true that emotions encourage action. The question is, what type of actions or behaviors are you encouraging? If you're using fear and anxiety, then you're going to get fearful and anxious behaviors back. So one thing is just think about your language and think about your use of emotions and be more tactical and choose wisely. So this is not a matter of run around and be yourself no matter what. You have to be authentic, so don't get me wrong, but you also have to use show colors that are appropriate to your context. So the more appropriate phrase, and this comes from some of our faculties such as Rob Goffey and Herminia Ibarra, is think of yourself as a leader more as an authentic chameleon. You're always a chameleon, but you have to be very, very conscious about what colors you're showing. So I think that's the start on just a very micro level. Second thing is be really clear about meaning. Talk about why you're asking people to do something different. Don't just focus on what you expect them to do differently. As a matter of fact, if you really want to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship in your organization, you don't want to tell people the how, because that's actually discouraging innovation and entrepreneurship. So just give them a sense of the goal and let them help you collectively determine how you get there.
Okay, fantastic. Be an authentic chameleon. I like that phrase. So
yes.
So next question that we've got, Daniel asks, what are the typical ways in which companies fail in implementing this type of DNA level fundamental change?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There are actually some fairly typical failures when you look at companies trying to do this. One failure mode, and I alluded to this, is trying to change too much too quickly. So you try to take out the bureaucratic model, which is very elaborate, and you try to push that out and put something new in that's equally developed and equally elaborate. People don't understand it. It's likely to have problems you can't anticipate. It blows up. One organization that tried to do this and hasn't had good success is a division of Amazon called Zappos. I'm sure you've all heard of it, an online shoe retailer. That's basically what happened at Zappos. They developed what they thought was this great alternative to bureaucracy. They had pages and pages of manuals, but it was almost as Byzantine as the bureaucracy. So people didn't understand it. They didn't give people enough time to adapt to it. It wasn't the right fit. So that's one. Weirdly, when you're trying to create something flatter, much more open, if you take a top-down approach and to impose a new alternate structure, you're going to have a lot of unintended consequences. I think the second typical failure is trying to manage all the old interdependencies that you had before you put in the new model. So you might try to have keep all the horizontal links in the organization and the vertical links, and what happens is you're trying to ask too many people communicating with too many other people on too many issues, and then the thing just collapses under the weight of all that complexity. So I think one example of a company that has avoided this failure is a huge company, Cemex, the Mexican cement company, very big global company. They were built through acquisitions around the world, but cement is a local-to-local business. At least the logistics of it are not global. They had an online marketing community, and they said, kind of crazy. We've got all these brands all around the world. We're not aligning them. We all have slightly different product lines with slightly varying specs. So they just got a community in that department got together completely voluntarily and made some suggestions for what they might do differently. And now most of the company has migrated to that, but it never happened with a chief marketing officer saying we have to do something and this is it. So I think what these companies are finding is if you make it easy for people to connect together, make it easy for them to identify common needs, make it easy for them to collaborate, then you'll get better solutions out. But if you try to hardwire every one of those in advance, we're going to have this circle connecting with that circle, it just becomes too complex. I think it has to be much more pull-driven rather than push. And then finally, I just allude back to one of the last things I said, the alternatives to bureaucracy have to emerge. So use an iterative approach. Bureaucracy has been perfected over many decades through lots of trial and error. So we'll have to do the same thing in hacking management and inventing management 2.0. Lots of small bets, not one huge multi-million-pound bet. Lots of small bets, trying lots of different tactics, which collectively get you to your new place.
And Adam, do you think that leaders and companies are more open to kind of evolving their models in this way in the conversations that you're having with organizations?
It's starting to happen. I think more what it is now is that more and more leaders and CEOs recognize the problem. And now what's maybe only now emerging is that a greater, hopefully critical mass of leaders are saying, and I'm going to do something about it, versus the resigned shrug. I think, even 10, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of leaders were going, yeah, too much bureaucracy, but they were resigned to it. They didn't know how to change it. And as I said at the very beginning, they were dealing more with the symptoms. If they were at all trying to do anything about it, that was different. So I think more and more leaders are saying, okay, I agree a more fundamental approach needs to be taken. And perhaps they don't know yet the how of how to do that. And that's why what we're trying to do at London Business School and in the Management Lab is create a movement, right? So across companies, across industries, if you will, let's crowdsource this problem. And let's share our successes and our setbacks so that we can find solutions faster. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, I'm hearing more and more leaders willing to go there. Still a lot of people saying, help me with the how.
Okay, and Elaine has just added to this. So what you're describing there, is that like a modern quality improvement team?
I'm sure we're all going to have slightly different definitions of that phrase. So, but yeah, if assuming we're sharing a common understanding of that, yeah, I think there are some similarities. It's just that you're looking at the whole organizational model rather than a product or a process. Because the funny thing is we're all used to doing that, right? Quality improvement teams for products, for services, for process. We do it all the time. We're comfortable doing that. But you ask, the same group to look at the organization and they kind of freak out, right? It's too daunting. What hope do we have? It hasn't changed in 150 years. But we have to turn our attention to that.
Fantastic. Well, the clock has fast approached 2 o'clock, Adam, so I'm going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you very much indeed. We've not quite got through all the questions, so we'll perhaps revisit those at a later date. And just a reminder, everybody, that we'll be sending the recorded version of the webinar over in the next couple of days, so please do look out for that. Once again, thank you all for taking the time to join us today, to Adam and to London Business School. If you do have any further questions, please do contact us, or if you've got any feedback on the webinar, please do let us know. So that concludes the session today, and we look forward to seeing you on another Change Board webinar very soon. Have a really good afternoon.